China has been staging a massive military parade to mark 70 years of communist rule. Some 15,000 soldiers, hundreds of tanks, military hardware, including a nuclear-capable hypersonic missile, all rumbling through the capital, Beijing. The celebration commemorating the founding of the People's Republic of China by Chairman Mao in 1949, an event that ended a bitter civil war that claimed millions of lives. President Xi said China's development would be peaceful, but that its military would safeguard its sovereignty and security. Let's bring in DW's Matthias Böllinger, who's at the celebrations in Beijing. Good morning to you, Matthias. President Xi saying this morning that nothing can stop the rise of China. Was that message more for the home crowd or for the international audience?
It was, of course, for both, but the more important crowd here is the home crowd, because what Xi Jinping, his ideology, what his narrative, his promise to his people is that he will make China strong and powerful. His predecessors have started economic reforms. They have started this economic miracle. They have achieved some economic prosperity, and he will be the one who gives China the role that he thinks it should have on the international stage. These the preparations and the parade has been broadcast throughout China broadly in social media, on TV, in newspapers. So it is really a show of what the Communist Party thinks it has achieved.
Okay, and it's also a show of just how omnipotent it appears the Communist Party's grip on power is. Is there any opposition at all to the Chinese Communist Party?
Well, there is no organized opposition in China. As soon as people start assembling, organizing themselves, they will be very quickly taken into custody or will face other repercussions. There is, of course, people have different opinions, as in every place on the earth, and there are of course people who challenge the authority of the Communist Party. There have been lawyers who want the party to stick to the laws it has when it breaks them. There are activists, environmental activists, who challenge them on certain fields of policies, and there is of course an uprising in Hong Kong that is challenging the Communist Party more than anything has challenged the Communist Party within the last 30 years.
And what about President Xi? Looking forward, as China marks this anniversary, what are the main challenges that he's facing right now?
Well, this anniversary and this military parade comes at a moment where there is a lot of insecurity in the economy. Growth rates have slowed down. They could just not keep up with the pace that they had 10 years ago. And the trade war that Donald Trump has started is also, of course, threatening China's growth. And so these are the main economic challenges, apart from, of course, the political challenge that comes with the protesters in Hong Kong who have been on the streets for 3 months. This is something the Communist Party in China had to deal with only once. That was in 1989 when the students in Beijing protested, much less furious than the protesters in Hong Kong today. And it's very clear that Beijing hasn't really found a clue how to deal with this.
Matthias, thanks so very much for that from Beijing. Okay, let's go straight to Hong Kong now, where there are no big celebrations today and where DW's Charlotte Chelson-Pill is standing by for us. Good day to you, Charlotte. Hong Kong, of course, has been dominated by these anti-Beijing demonstrations we've been seeing for months now. What's the mood where you are this morning?
We're one of a number of protests that are taking place across Hong Kong today, Brian. As I'm sure you can see behind me, there are masses of people out on the streets. Now, they've declared today a day of mourning. Many of the people, as I'm sure you can see, are dressed in black as a symbol of that theme of this set of protests that are taking place today. Hong Kong really is on lockdown at the moment. This usually would be a very busy shopping street. This, of course, is a national holiday, and yet it is filled with protesters on the streets. The shops shuttered, a lot of train stations as well closed, citing security reasons. Today really is being dominated by these protests that we're seeing all over the place. In fact, we have heard that tear gas has been deployed at one of those protests where some clashes have started to erupt. Where we are now, though still peaceful, people here heading towards government buildings to make their voices heard there.
Charlotte, we're getting some live images right now as we speak about that lockdown you mentioned today in Hong Kong, a strong show of force there. What do protesters have planned in spite of the heavy police presence?
Well, it's widely expected that these protests will go on late into the evening. People here have really been gearing up for today. Everyone that we've spoken to over the last week or so has been saying that they really want to save their energy for today. That is because they know that the eyes of the world will be watching what Hong Kong does today, and they want to make the most of that public attention, worldwide attention, to make their complaints heard. There is also a sense that by holding big protests here today, that they could show up and even embarrass authorities in Beijing who are trying to present a show of their prowess today in Beijing. So we are expecting protests long into the evening, potentially some violence as well. We have already seen, as I've mentioned, some clashes breaking out. We saw pepper spray used in the early hours of this morning already. This is going to be a long day here in Hong Kong.
Okay, and Charlotte Chelsea-Pill will have more on that long day from Hong Kong as it moves forward. Thanks so much for now. Well, with me in the studio now is Janke Ortel, China expert at the German Marshall Fund. Good morning to you. Thanks for coming in. As we saw there, Hong Kong is clearly a threat to Beijing's authority. Is Beijing going to wait it out, or could the leaders in Beijing, President Xi, risk a Tiananmen-style military crackdown?
As you can see over the past couple of months now, they've been waiting for this to end. They've been waiting for this to stop on natural terms, to peter out. What we haven't seen is like a clear movement. There have been signaling from Beijing's side that they could intervene whenever they wanted to with the People's Armed Police or with troops. But it does not seem very likely because there's not much to gain. Also, I think we have a problem if we focus on that too much, because now anything below that level seems like a good outcome for us. So in the West, if we think about just the military intervention as being key, as being like that's the red line not to cross, then that's a pretty low bar for the Chinese government not to.
Okay, and they will no doubt take that into consideration. As they did today, what they were displaying in Beijing, one of the things we saw there is a new generation of military technology, the hypersonic nuclear-capable missile out there. It wasn't alone. It wasn't the only thing we saw. Is Beijing close to stealing America's competitive edge militarily?
I think what Beijing has demonstrated today is that it is going to be more deadly to attack China in any kind of form, and it's going to be much more fierce in retaliation. So the competitive edge is they're not on equal terms yet, but there are pockets of excellence in which China has achieved near equal status to American military capabilities, especially in the hypersonic field, for example. AI, we're talking about a lot of the drone technologies, for example. So there are pockets of excellence in which it means that it is definitely harder to beat China in a military confrontation.
How does this factor into the South China Seas? We're all looking at that right now. It's not just the United States, the Philippines, Vietnam, a lot of regional players. Does this military progress that China has made mean that that region now belongs to China?
Well, we haven't seen anything to the contrary in the latest, except for the freedom of navigation operations, who have been a show of force of some sort by the US and other Western powers. We have not seen much of a competition about the dominance in that region anymore. This is basically China's territory.
Okay, President Trump in the US, well, he wants to turn that around. He wants to slow China's rise with the tariffs, with better protections for intellectual property. Is there support for this ring-fencing China strategy here in Berlin?
Well, there's definitely support on the analysis of the problem that we're facing, China's current economic posture, its assertiveness in the region. This is definitely something that is not something that is appreciated in Berlin and in Europe more broadly. But there is not an agreement on the ends that are approached. And the way in which the Trump administration is approaching China at the moment. Berlin certainly doesn't want to get in between Washington and Beijing, its security provider, and its most important economic partner.
Okay, so there's big economic reasons to stay on the fence right now for Berlin. Over the last few years, there's been a growing realization that prosperity did not bring China the democracy and freedom that we hoped for when it entered the WTO in 2001. How should the West respond when we look at Hong Kong, for example?
I think it is interesting to see that the West is not responding really at the moment. It's awfully quiet around Hong Kong, except for in Washington, one has to say. In Europe, there's not a lot of voices. I heard when Chancellor Merkel traveled to China just recently, there wasn't a lot of criticism on this. So this shows that there is not a lot of leverage left. So Europe needs to grow stronger and needs to act more forcefully and more in closer coordination with the United States on these issues if it wants to have a voice in this.
Something that may prove difficult for Berlin and Brussels, no doubt.
Definitely will. I mean, it's hard to side with the Trump administration at this point in time if you're based in Berlin.
Janke Oerdel, China expert at the German Marshall Fund, thank you so very much for coming in.
Thank you.